Welcome, everyone. It is a pleasure to have you with us, and my thanks to the organisers at the Global Philanthropy Forum for arranging these 3 days of truly important discussion. My name is Steve Trent, and I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Environmental Justice Foundation. I've worked in the intersection of environment and human rights for over 30 years, conducting research, field investigations, and high-level advocacy for environmental justice. It's my pleasure to be your moderator today. And alongside me, we are very privileged to have 2 internationally recognised, highly experienced leaders in the field of climate research and policy. First, let me introduce Maxine Burkett, who is co-founder and executive director of the Institute for Climate and Peace. Maxine is also professor of law at the William S. Richardson Law School in the University of Hawaii and a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She is an expert in climate change law and policy with a specific focus on climate justice, climate-induced migration, climate change peace and conflict. Maxine, thank you so much for being with us today. We are also very fortunate to have with us Amali Tower, founder and executive director of the nonprofit Climate Refugees. Amali has worked internationally over the past 15 years to promote the protection of refugees and forcibly displaced persons in a variety of contexts, including in refugee resettlement, protection, evaluation and research with the UN Refugee Agency in Kenya and Jordan, various NGOs throughout Africa, Asia, the Middle East and the United States. Amali, thank you so much for joining us in this discussion. Central to my task today is to present introductory remarks to frame our debate. In doing this, I will outline key issues surrounding global heating and environmental justice as these relate to the forced migration of people, presenting EJF's core proposal for action. But first, I feel it is important to outline the emergency within which our discussion takes place. Humanity is facing a planetary crisis that is unprecedented and which will impact all areas of our lives, curtailing basic freedoms and rights, eroding our ability to feed, clothe and educate ourselves, undermining economic development and poverty reduction, human health, education, gender, child rights, among much else. Climate change will fundamentally limit our ability to reach any of the Sustainable Development Goals. For many, it will take away the basics necessary for survival. Climate change is a threat multiplier, and it will act in this way across all sectors, all societies, in all geographies. And how we approach this central issue of environmental justice will either prevent or cause further war and conflict, lead to greater equality or inequality between and within nations. It will determine our future, not just as communities or nation states, but as a species. For many years, I've watched as much of the wealthy developed world has somehow viewed climate change as over there and in the future. Perhaps finally that is changing as societies across the world, rich and poor, are increasingly first-hand witnesses to the impacts of global heating. This month, devastating floods in Sudan have displaced over 500,000, with more than 100,000 farms and homes destroyed. Hunger will drive many to join the estimated 3 million Sudanese displaced internally and across borders. Along with much of the rest of the world, I've watched in horror as the fires in California, fueled by our heating climate, have burned over 4.6 million acres so far in 2020, with over 500,000 people being forced from their homes and at least 35 dead, with dozens more missing. Maria, Ida, Irma, Harvey, Katrina, Kenneth, a litany of names of increasingly destructive hurricanes and cyclones. And it is fitting that they are given human names. This crisis is ours to claim. These human stories are unfolding against a backdrop of stark facts. The average temperatures over the last decade, 2010 to 2019, were the highest on record. The current atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases are unprecedented in the last 800,000 years. EGF's work with its local partners has enabled us to document some of the human consequences of this, gathering accounts of damning impacts from low-lying countries such as Bangladesh, small island developing states such as Papua New Guinea and the Maldives, and arid or semi-arid regions such as Mali and the other countries in the Sahel. In each of these geographies, we have documented a growing number of people forced from their homes by extreme weather, dammed by too much water and many by too little. And these trends are accelerating. Globally, since 2008, we have seen an average of around 21.2 million people forced from their homes every year by extreme weather. It's 58,000 each day, 41 for each minute. And this does not account for those forced out by slow onset weather events. Now we have some studies that say by 2060, an estimated 1.4 billion people could be forced to leave their homes. To date, there are few cases where climate is the sole factor in migration. But as I have already said, climate change is a threat multiplier. This means that the impacts of climate change are overwhelmingly experienced, first and worst, where exposure to threats coincides with populations dependent on the natural environment for their livelihood, in poorer nations, and in geographies where governance is weak and existing conflicts and stresses are manifest. And this is why 95% of displacement has taken place in the developing world, along with 99% of all weather-related deaths. Yet, and we must remember, the world's 50 least developed countries have together contributed less than 1% of global anthropogenic carbon emissions and have benefited the least from our addiction to carbon. And it is in this context that we can clearly see that climate change is both a global existential threat, but also a profoundly important issue of environmental justice. So, just how should we view this? Where and what are the answers? Well, for EJF, these unquestionably lie in global cooperation, compassion, and good governance. International agreements may be a blunt tool for what is often a complex and multifaceted situation on the ground. However, they can be a powerful force for good. And the speed of the climate crisis means that such coordinated action, able to deliver a rules-based response, is urgently needed. Those displaced by the climate crisis are falling through the cracks in our international legal system. International legal frameworks governing migration and refugee rights do not have legal categories which reflect the new reality of climate-induced forced migration. It is true that they are not refugees in the most widely recognized sense of the word, since they are not fleeing persecution, war, or violence, but they are fleeing the destruction of their homes and livelihoods through no fault of their own. Climate refugees need legal recognition. Their status and plight must be clearly defined. Without such definition, how is it possible to craft a coordinated, just, and effective international response? We are beginning to see some progress towards a new framework which recognizes the links between climate change, conflict, and migration. The 2018 Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees both acknowledge climate-induced displacement in their language. But these agreements are not legally binding and do not represent enforceable definition or confer rights to people displaced by the climate emergency. The Global Compact is a soft power tool. Yet despite this light touch, several countries have withdrawn, including the USA, Australia, Austria, Chile, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, among others. These documents represent a starting point to the international conversation on climate refugees, but vastly more political commitment is needed. EJF believes that there is an urgent need for an unambiguous, legally binding agreement to protect those forced from their homes by global heating. And this must be pursued as a new agreement entirely outside of the scope of the 1951 Convention. Recognizing this, EJF has commissioned international legal firm Linklaters to create an initial high-level draft, and we have this to inform discussion. This work may seem arcane, distant, and disconnected from the harsh reality of life as a refugee, but it is essential. Far more time, energy, effort, and money needs to be applied to this kind of work. Collectively, we must answer the many outstanding questions. not least what makes someone a climate refugee. What is the immediacy of danger required? What obligations do those nations that have contributed the most to global heating have for those who have contributed the least? Any international agreement must recognise the complex and multifaceted nature of the climate crisis and its related societal threats. It must fully engage with the role of global heating as a threat multiplier. Political leaders must also resist the temptation to buy small amounts of time by sending people to places that are only temporary, deferring cost or long-term solutions. Any agreement will need to engage and secure notions of sovereignty, cultural identity, alongside the economic, social, and environmental needs of forced migrants. Yes, many, and for now, we can still say most, climate displaced people will stay within national boundaries. But in the future, this is not the case. As the Sahel burns, as small islands sink and disappear, as other low-lying nations are submerged, where will they go? They will have no option but to cross national boundaries. They will be refugees. So to conclude my opening remarks before we will show a short film we've produced, especially for this panel, I just want to say climate change has a human face. Now imagine that face to be your wife or husband, your father or mother, daughter or son, your friends or neighbours. If they were forced from their home, forced into a foreign territory, what response would you wish for them? For me, the simplest question we have today, and our main job, is to answer that and to give answers that will satisfy us and will interest and engage all those who are joining this conversation. So I'd now like to show a short film, as I say, that we've cut specially for this event before returning to our speakers.
Every year it gets hotter and hotter.
Climate change adds an impetus to an existing trend.
Existing problems, existing conflicts with the climate crisis, it doubles and it makes it even more dangerous.
Last year around the world, at least 23 million people were displaced by extreme weather.
This one about a 500-kilometer radius, so it's a large storm too.
With emergency officials fearing there is worse to come.
Our thoughts and prayers go out to our neighbors and family there.
Climate change is definitely a human rights issue because the people who are going to suffer the consequences are generally poor people living in the most vulnerable parts of the planet. So it's a problem created by human beings, particularly rich human beings, and the people who will suffer are the poor. And that is a moral issue. That is something that is not right.
We're hearing that we could have 200 million climate-displaced people by about 2050 or shortly afterwards. That has to be managed, and it has to be managed in a way where people share the burden equitably, where there are rules, and if you have a rules-based, then you've got to have a framework that allows for rules of accountability.
Die Menschen, die vertrieben sind oder die ihre Heimat verloren haben oder sie verlieren werden, ist, dass der Status nicht geklärt ist. Also wir haben zwar die Genfer Flüchtlingskonventionen, wir haben Regeln, wir haben das Grundrecht auf Asyl, aber was tun wir eigentlich, wenn der König von Tuvalu sagt, wir sind gar keine Flüchtlinge, aber uns wird alles genommen? Uns wird alles genommen, heißt es, wir sind sehr hinterher, was den Status dieser Menschen angeht, was die Rechte dieser Menschen angeht.
If Europe thinks they have a problem with migration today caused by the Arab Spring and what's happened in the Middle East, wait 20 years and see what climate change drives people out of Africa, the Sahel especially, and we're talking now not just 1 or 2 million, 10 or 20, and they're not going to South Africa. They're going across the Mediterranean.
What we're talking about here is an existential threat to our civilization in the longer term. In the short term, it carries all sorts of risks as well. And it requires a human response on a scale that has never been achieved before.
Die Klimakrise, die größte globale Herausforderung. Es geht um die Zukunftsfähigkeit dieses Planeten, es geht um globale Gerechtigkeit, es geht um das Recht auf Wohnen, auf Leben, um Menschenrechte für Millionen von Menschen.
Some would equate it to the ship, the battleship that's got the momentum, and if you don't start to stop it now, that momentum's just going to keep it going for quite a while. Even if you start now to stop climate change, we have to start now.
There's no dry location here. The entire town, they're pretty much underwater.
We have an existential threat. We know that we only have a short time, and we are the generation that have to do it. And future generations will not thank us if we miss this opportunity.
So thank you to the technical team for making that all work so smoothly. So I'd like to very quickly involve our expert guests here. And if you will allow me to ask each of you, perhaps beginning with Maxine, because you're at the top of my screen, the simple question to give your framing: what do you believe needs to be done regarding the issue of forced migration, environmentally forced migration, climate refugees, call it what you will? And then if I can add a second question to that, what do you believe can be done, recognizing the imperfect world that we live in? Maxine?
Gosh, Steve, thank you so much. First, it's a pleasure to be here and to be joining all of you on this panel. This is obviously a very urgent conversation, and I think the question itself suggests some of the dire need here, which is, what are we calling this? What is the phenomenon, and how do we sort of capture it in a way that it is both true to the complexity, but doesn't suggest a level of overwhelm, right? That we're sort of immobilized in our thinking about this. The way I like to think about climate-induced migration or climate migration, which is generally what I call it, is that it is a function of the place where you are from, where you have deep cultural ties, often where your ancestors are buried, where your family networks have developed over, in many cases, generations, centuries, is no longer able to support your livelihoods. And in so much of what we're doing right now in terms of climate migration is thinking about the triggers, thinking about the places where people will be coming from, how they will move, and their status in transit. And a lot of what we need to also be thinking about is how people can stay in those places that they care so deeply about. I do think you're right in noting that in the future, we are going to be talking about a lot of cross-border migration. At the moment, this is a profoundly local kind of phenomenon for the most part. And I think we need to better understand some of the cultural and sort of psychosocial factors that come in to decision-making around whether or not to stay or to go. And also to recognize that sometimes the migration itself, the ability to move, if it's not the result of a kind of acute incident like a storm or flood, that the ability to go is really very much determined by your capacity to get a ticket out. Right. And so in some ways, when you're seeing projections, the worst of the worst, the situations that are the most dire, the places and individuals who have the fewest resources to actually make that move are trapped in place. And that decision to stay in place should be a decision. Right. It shouldn't be a function of circumstances in which you actually see projections in which the countries that are seen to be in the hot spot, there's actually reduced migration because the capacity to leave is not available to them. The other thing I'll say, there are a number of things we could touch on, but the other thing I'll say before sort of pausing is to just describe that when we talk about the receiving communities, the places that people are going, those communities also need to be kept in mind and supported. And that's important because we want to encourage a spirit of welcome, not one of fear. And we want to acknowledge the fact that changes to any environment, whether it's because of new residents, because of environmental stressors that will not spare any community, need to be kept in mind as we're planning. How are we supporting the host or receiving communities, in addition to obviously a big part of the conversation we're having now, which is what are the rights for those who are moving while they're in transit, and certainly when they relocate and resettle.
Thank you.
There.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Insightful. Can I quickly ask, Amali, would you like to answer the same question? I think get your vision and framing.
Yeah. Well, let me just like Maxine said, there's a lot to say. I think, one of the things that tends to be underrepresented here is the voice of potentially impacted communities and actually impacted communities now. They're really not part of the conversation at all when it comes, and that runs the gamut from terminology to frameworks to solutions, and whether that's going to be choices and opportunities that uphold dignity, that uphold resilience. Migration is very much a choice and a right. It's a right that we're meant to be upholding. It's a fundamental human right that we should be providing safe pathways for. A lot of what we're seeing take place in a refugee context, in a displacement context, and now in a climate context, whatever context it may be happening in, what we have been seeing take place are fundamental breakdowns in those safe pathways. A lot of that also has to be encapsulated in this conversation, because that is also very much at stake as far as an increasing factor here. So you can't have a conversation that doesn't take into account speaking to the impact of communities. Now, by that I also mean then, this whole conversation about terminology, for example. So there are in some communities that say, there's been a lot of conversation, for example, about we don't want to be designated as refugees. We don't want to be even termed this way. But I think it's very interesting to unpack what exactly was said. That was said at the end of a very long list of statements. It was said because here are all the things that we would like to see richer countries do, receiving countries potentially do, countries that could step up with climate finance, that could assist with adaptation and resiliency. It was a whole host of options and things that needed to be done to actually uphold rights, protection, dignity, safe pathways. When all those things failed, if and when they failed, then we could talk about resettlement. We could talk about terminology. We could even discuss whether we were refugees. And I think, that tends to get overlooked when we jump right to the end of the conversation, which is that they didn't want to be called refugees. That's actually not the whole statement. And one of the things that I think we need to unpack from that is that there's a whole lot of dignity and resiliency in the term refugee that we need to take back. So by talking to communities, that's just two examples, of what's at stake. I think that we're not really taking stock of.
Thank you very much, Amali. So, as I might have expected, immediately we are trying to carve a way through a huge issue. And we could discuss any one of the points that both of you have made for the rest of the time we have. But what I'm going to do is two things. First, I want to speak to the audience and say, if you have any questions, please ask them, because we want to hear from you, and our experts want to be able to answer you rather than me. But before we get those questions, going to ask one other question. It is challenging, I know it is, but I think we need to look at it. So in the context of these estimates, 1.2 billion, 1.4 billion, 1.6 billion, take your pick. We are talking vast numbers. And I think it is true to say, whilst I completely recognise what you say, Maxine, about receiving communities and those communities that are affected, where they want to stay, there will be this huge transboundary migration. So my question, again, in the same order, if you'll allow me, what can the international community do to address this, rather than just allow a wave of human suffering to come and then be reactive to it? Is there anything we can do in a proactive measure that can help this situation?
Yeah, great question. Just first on the numbers, right? The numbers are dizzying, and you hear, as you mentioned, something between 1.2 or 1.4 billion people by 2050, 2060, to pick your year. And one of the difficulties is that we're talking about a time frame in which there's a lot of fluidity and flow, right? It's not that we're saying that by 2060, presumably 1.4 billion people will all of a sudden get up and move, right? We're talking about a fairly dynamic process over the next several decades. And in fact, what we know now is that it is mostly temporary, local, and it's in the global south. So when I'm talking about receiving communities, I'm mostly thinking with a vast number of receiving communities right now, which are already profoundly stressed communities, profoundly over-extracted communities, places that are supporting the overconsumption of wealthy countries. And so I don't want us to, I think what the numbers do is that they capture the gravity and magnitude of the issue. They beg for notice, and they beg for a better understanding about how people make that decision at a level that is meaningful for our engagement. I do worry that we do two things when we use the large numbers. One is that it just the antennae of the security infrastructure does go up, and we think more about protection, especially in the global north, and about the enabling of sound migration supported in primarily the global south. And I mention this because the fact that it's mostly internal displacement right now means that there's a different kind of way of engagement that we need to consider. And it's not necessarily through international instruments, although that will be important. It's recognizing that I think the failures in the current instruments, I actually tend to be more of a, instead of building new infrastructure, what about the current infrastructure is failing? And there's a lot, especially in international law. And so do we have the opportunity? I think it would be more time relevant in terms of how little time we have to actually audit the current infrastructure that we have for supporting communities in the global south, for the ways of injecting support, for how we give country level support, how we get to communities. There are organizations that, like the Global Green Grants Fund that I serve on the board of, that is an excellent example of how one can get to a community level manner of support, and thinking about it creatively in spite of the infrastructure that that we have currently. The last thing I'll say is that from my conversations, it is really difficult to know what 2060 is going to look like, to be perfectly honest. What we're doing here is a risk assessment. And I think we all agree on this side. What is absolutely true is that this is a one-sided risk. It's a question of how bad, not a question of if, right? And so if this is the risk assessment, we can at least say we know that it's going to be a big problem. But we also know that 2060 is completely unknown at this point, because there are factors that we have not even taken into account that we see playing out right now in 2020. I was just talking to my colleagues about giving lectures about climate migration in 2007 and saying by 2020 we'll see this. And there are factors that we didn't even take into account about the current state that we're seeing right now. That after Hurricane Laura, it was actually the absence of wealthy country. It was the lack of air conditioning, right? That is causing people to either move or to have casualties that were not able to be adapted to. So what I encourage is that we understand that these numbers are important indicators of the speed and complexity of the issue, but that we approach it from a position of understanding what are the barriers to our success right now, and actually addressing those with great intention.
Thank you very much. So just to the audience again, if you want to submit questions through the chat box in the conference platform, please do. Amali, your vision, your response to the same question?
Yeah, my thoughts on projections. Yeah, I totally agree with so much of what Maxine said. There's a lot of talk on projections, and to some unfortunate degree, it gets a lot of media buzz, right? To say by 2050, 2060, 1.2, and this, that, and the other, and that can actually really tends to sort of, for lack of a better term, hijack the story. And what you often see come forth from that is that Western countries, namely North America and Europe, are going to be on the receiving end of billions of migrants, refugees. The terminology is always mixed because forget we don't know what to call climate displaced people. People don't even know the difference between IDP, migrant, refugee. So, there's a lot of work we need to do on that front alone. But that aside, I take, real exception to the fact that becomes the story. When, point of fact, right now in the refugee context, I'm talking about 1951 refugee context, it is the developing world that has for generations hosted all of the refugees just about, and does so, while tackling poverty and gross underdevelopment, does so for generations on end. So when we're talking about climate displacement and what we're looking at in terms of projections, the data will tell you that people generally, if they do cross borders, they tend to cross borders into neighboring countries. So for us to have these grand projections that say that people are going to go over into Europe and North America doesn't exactly gel with what we already know is happening in the refugee context, number one. Number two, why is that so? Because it costs a lot of money to travel. And refugees don't have that kind of money. So anybody who does actually cross a border and leave their country does so because they have just a little bit more means. That doesn't make them rich, even though the West likes to kind of portray that. That just makes them have a one-time opportunity, perhaps. That aside, whether someone is displaced internally or across borders does not change their need for protection or rights. And the guiding principles on internal displacement quite adequately demonstrates that. There's a reason why the international community had to come up with principles that protect people who are internally displaced in conflict and violence, even though those are sovereign citizens of the country in which they're already displaced. So whether someone's displaced internally or cross borders, I think, really does show that, that's really not the issue in terms of our capacity to fail, to meet people's needs. Migration isn't a certainty. Our inaction as an international community makes it a certainty. There's a lot we could do right now in terms of climate action. And I'm talking about migration as a result of climate change. That's not a certainty. And I think, finally, I'll just say, regarding projections. 1 second. That it's not about being an alarmist about the numbers. I think it's because that's often the criticism, right? I don't think it's about being an alarmist about the numbers. I think it's about being an alarmist about those protection gaps and those potential for gross rights violations. That's the missing element here that is very often not talked about. And when we talk about this issue, even it's so lacking a human rights framework that it's grossly to our detriment. And one of the reasons why we're not really advancing the conversation and why we're sort of stuck on terminology and frameworks, and a climate security framework is really as far as it kind of tends to go. And you know, that really needs to change.
Thank you very much. Well, I think it's really interesting to see there's a lot of agreement coming from two quite different perspectives, and if I can, I share much of what you're saying. I share those views. I do think that this issue needs to be framed in the context of environmental justice, a bigger picture of environmental justice. I think the human rights agenda to it has not even been begun to be touched upon yet. So we do actually have a question from the audience, and I having asked them, I'd like to put that to you both. It's quite specific, and it says, can we say that people in Sahel in Africa should be regarded as climate refugees as they migrate to southern territories? And if we reverse the order, perhaps with you first, Amali.
Well, it kind of depends on the context, really, of the question. Now, the Kampala Accord, which the continent of Africa has adopted, are essentially the guiding principles on internal displacement that the continent accepted as saying that anybody within in any African state that's displaced, that crosses a border into another African state, would be afforded a whole suite of protections, a whole suite of rights that will basically carry from one African state to the next. That's a bit broad, but for the purposes of our conversation, let's leave it there. So to some degree, while that doesn't afford someone refugee status, it certainly does a lot more than we have in a lot of other contexts of transferring rights while someone is moving across borders. And that is a wonderful progression of exactly what we're talking about here. So I wouldn't go so far as to, in the context and the framework of what we have now, I don't think one could say that they're a refugee. I don't know if whichever Sahelian country this is or whichever receiving country this is might consider them refugees, legally that is, but it doesn't really change the fact that, like I said, because of the Kampala Accord, they still have a vast degree of rights and protections. So terminology and names and what that might bring is almost a moot point at that.
Thank you, Amali. So we have another question. So if I could go to you, Maxine, and say, here somebody is asking, what is the responsibility of international companies in the refugee crisis, and how do we involve them in the research of the solutions?
Yeah, thank you for that question. If I could just very quickly, just a quick addendum to what Amali said, which is that when we are talking about the rights of anyone, talking about the duties and obligations is also really important. That's where I think, just to reinforce what's been said, that's where sometimes I think we are thinner on our sort of articulation of what are your duties in order to meet the rights of these of individuals and communities, because human rights are really individual based when in fact most people see themselves in a complex web of community, right, of family. And so that's an important, I think, sort of evolution of our understanding of rights that I think we'll have to see over the next little bit. with respect to international companies, this is actually a great question, I think, for a few reasons. One is that we are, again, as I've said, my sort of refrain, I think a key takeaway is that a lot of times we're sort of focusing on what more can we do versus how are we doing now that we can do less of, right? So the do less harm discussion. And I think international corporations have a lot of opportunity to really reflect on what they are doing now, that is creating an enabling environment, but not an enabling environment for the things that we'd like to see, but for the stressors, again, that are causing some background environmental degradation that's making adaptation in place much more difficult. This is just one angle or one approach that you could consider. But my encouragement of the international companies, of philanthropic ventures, is to think about what is it that we're supporting now that's actually having the effect of making people more vulnerable, and not stripping agency, but recognizing the ways in which extraction, support of overconsumption in the global north, a support of monoculture, sort of support of careers and opportunities in places, particularly in the global south, that are not allowing them to maintain a diversified livelihood that would actually be, certainly in the short to medium term, much more advantageous if they are looking at the kinds of acute and long-term stressors that are happening in those spaces. So my encouragement is not, obviously there are opportunities to support financially and make sure that funding gets on the ground. But I think there's a good degree of soul searching that needs to happen in these major organizations and companies about what are we doing that's actually creating an environment that makes it far more difficult for people to do well in the places that they are, and at the same time accelerating the impacts of climate change and climate change itself.
Very interesting.
So that's what I would offer.
Thank you very much. Now we have, unfortunately, just 3 minutes left. So I'm going to ask one question, which maybe will take us to the end. And it's probably a version of something I've already asked, but I think it's useful for the purposes of this meeting. What single request do you put to philanthropists? What you call it, what you will, the big idea, the one action, frame it how you like. What message would you like the audience to take away today for you? And maybe again, if I could start with you, Amali.
I think I have to stand by what I said earlier, which is I see an overabundance of discussion about projections and securitized, borderized elements to this particular niche part of climate change, and the lens on that is, how does climate displacement impact rich countries? Whether that's the intent or not doesn't change the fact that that is the perception. That is the way it's framed in terms of results. If we want to change that perspective, if we want to add another voice to the conversation, then I think we need to fund data and advocacy research. And that's not just me talking, Amali Tower or Climate Refugees. That's the UN Security Council talking. That is the UN Global Compact for Refugees. On migration talking. I think the Global Compact for Refugees might also have commentary that states that, but certainly the Global Compact for Migration does. A whole host of UN resolutions have supported that there's a lack of data in understanding what are the links, in understanding how exactly climate change impacts human mobility. So,
forgive me for interrupting. It's that I think I have 30 seconds left.
Let me leave it at that. That's all that needs to be said, and you get that from the voices of the impacted communities.
Very good. So if I can close with one comment that's taken from you both, I think it's don't just ask what can be done, but ask what we can stop doing. And we need support for funding for data research and advocacy research. I'd just like to say thank you all, and thank you very much to Maxine and Amali for being such interesting and valuable participants.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Molly. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you to both of you.
I think we have actually, let's say 15 seconds left now. Forgive me, I was slightly premature in that, but I think it's been really interesting learning this. I've learned something from you today. And I think this understanding, this kind of debate needs to carry on much further and much wider, much longer. We need to have those voices, and not least the voices of the communities who are most affected.
Yeah. I got so excited with the conversation, I forgot that we were sorry about that, Maxine.
That's okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.